There is a war the Anunnaki lost. Not a war with some external monster, not a war with chaos in the abstract, but a war that turned inward, God against God, authority against authority. And the evidence, whatever we decide that word evidence can mean, here sits in a climate-controlled vault beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Cataloged, numbered, labeled CBS 10673, a small fragment, perhaps 20 centimeters at its widest point, clay the color of dried river mud. Wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface 4,000 years ago by a reed stylus patient lines that were never meant to be patient. If you ever get close to it, close enough for a curator to place it on foam supports, close enough to see the irregular edges where it snapped, there's a strange contradiction you can't quite shake. It feels intimate, hand-sized, warm in that way old clay can feel warm, as if it holds on to the last body that touched it. And yet it is also indifferent. It does not care how many centuries pass. It does not care how many empires rise and fall above the soil that once covered it. It can wait. It has been waiting. When archaeologists pulled it from the ruins of Nippur in southern Iraq in the early 20th century, it was already broken, incomplete, the kind of damage that might be accidental. But as soon as you look at what remains, you start to wonder about the break. Because what is written there, what can still be read where the clay hasn't flaked away, doesn't feel like a story meant to be preserved in comfortable pieces. This is not a creation myth where gods bring order to chaos in one decisive act. It isn't a simple moral warning where humans misbehave and the heavens respond with punishment. This fragment is a shard of something larger, a record of disruption, a memory of conflict among the Anunnaki themselves, with casualties and consequences that ripple outward, forward, into every later text that tries to make sense of the world. Before we take even one more step, pause for a moment. If you're listening to this at night, remember that. If you're listening in the morning, remember that too. And if you want to leave a brief comment, your city, your country, what hour it is, where you are, keep it simple. No speeches, just a marker in time. Because there's something fitting about encountering material like this across different hours of the planet, in darkness and in light. This story lives in that same liminal space between what we can prove and what the texts insist we should know. The University of Pennsylvania is careful with CBS 10673. The fragment rests in archival housing designed to prevent further deterioration, humidity monitored, temperature monitored, access restricted. A staff member retrieves it for serious scholars, gloves, foam, a table cleared of everything unnecessary. And then on the surface of that small broken piece, a Sumerian voice still speaks. Not cleanly, not continuously, but enough. Enough to name the time before the flood. Enough to name cities that still echo through archaeology. Aridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. Enough to say in the old formula that kingship descended from heaven. But it does not describe peace after kingship arrives. It describes disruption. A council of divine beings split along factional lines. A decision made then contested. A warning delivered to a human king to build a boat, not because humans are irredeemably wicked, but because other gods have voted for annihilation. This is the Aridu Genesis, the oldest version of the flood narrative we possess preserved here, in fragments like a damaged window. And when you read it closely, the deluge begins to look less like punishment and more like policy, less like a moral lesson and more like escalation. A catastrophe that happens when the Anunnaki, if we follow the text's own logic, can no longer manage their own conflict. So the question is not, first, did the Anunnaki exist as flesh and blood? That question comes later, and it may never be answerable in the way people want it to be answerable. The question that comes first is quieter and more disturbing. Why did Sumerian scribes record their gods this way? Why are these divine figures not serene, omnipotent, and unified, but bureaucratic, divided political? Why do the texts return again and again to labor, disputes, assassination plots, territorial struggles, coups and civil wars that require intervention, arbitration, and sometimes violent resolution? If these stories are merely symbols, natural forces wearing human faces, or psychological tensions dramatized in myth, then why do they contain such tactical and procedural detail? Why do they care so much about who holds the tablet of destinies, the object that confers supreme authority? Why does that tablet keep getting stolen, fought over, and transferred through force? And why does the Sumerian king list inscribed on artifacts like the Weld Blundell Prism, now housed at the Ashmolean Museum, record kingship, jumping from city to city, with the phrase was struck down, separating dynasties, as if regime change occurred through violence rather than peaceful succession? The academic consensus has answers. Enlil represents storm and authority. Enki symbolizes wisdom and water. Their conflicts dramatize tension force versus cunning order versus innovation. This reading is not wrong. It accounts for much, but it does not account for everything. It does not account for the texture of these narratives, the way they feel less like metaphors invented to teach a lesson, and more like memories processed through theology. CBS 10673 is fragmentary, yes, but what it preserves is not just a scene, it preserves a pattern. And once you see the pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it. In the next part, we begin tracing that pattern across the corpus text by text, conflict by conflict, until the question becomes unavoidable. If we take these tablets seriously as records rather than inventions, what kind of war would leave evidence like this? And notice what we have not done yet. We have not rushed to decide what is true. We have not tried to win an argument in the first 5 minutes. We have only held the fragment up to the light and asked why it was written the way it was written, why it was copied and recopied, why it survived as a broken thing instead of disappearing entirely. It has been patient for 4,000 years. It can wait longer while we rebuild what was broken. Because once the pattern is visible, it begins to pull on everything else. Not in a straight line, in circles. Back to the same questions again and again from slightly different angles. And that is how these texts themselves seem to want to be read. Once you have a fragment like CBS 10673 in mind, the rest of the Mesopotamian corpus starts to rearrange itself. Not because we discover new material, not because a hidden tablet suddenly appears, but because the same tensions keep returning again and again, like a melody you didn't notice until you heard it repeated. A conflict here, a negotiation there, a decree that sounds final, and then quietly a loophole, a council vote, an oath, a betrayal of the oath, a weapon that cannot be allowed to remain in the wrong hands. And always underneath all of it, the same uncomfortable implication: the gods are not unified. They never were. The mainstream scholarly position, as you know, is that these are theological narratives, stories that explain cosmic order, natural phenomena, human mortality, and political legitimacy. And there is truth in that. A text like the Atrahasis epic does function as an origin story for human labor and suffering. A text like the Enuma Elish does function as Babylonian political theology, celebrating Marduk's elevation, and by extension, Babylon's centrality. A text like Inanna's descent does function in ritual contexts tied to cycles that people lived through and depended on. But function is not the same thing as origin. A story can serve a purpose in a later society and still preserve older material that came from somewhere else, older anxieties, older memories, older patterns that weren't invented simply to support a king or a priesthood. So we keep asking slowly and without forcing an answer too soon. Why do these myths feel like dossiers? Why do they read again and again, like disputes inside a governing system? Why do they return so obsessively to procedures, assemblies, councils, votes, oaths, accusations, trials of guilt and innocence, rather than drifting in the timeless fog we expect from pure myth? And why do they return to the same mechanism of authority, almost like a fixed law? Hold the instrument of command, and you can rule. Lose it, and you cannot. In other words, why does power in these texts behave like a transferable thing? Sometimes it is literally transferable kingship, taken from one city to another, carried off, relocated. Sometimes it is embodied in an object, the tablet of destinies, the me, the seal, the regalia. Sometimes it is embodied in a role, king of the gods, queen of heaven, lord of the Anzu. But however it is framed, it is always vulnerable. And vulnerability invites conflict. You can feel the scribe circling the same question without ever stating it in modern terms. If authority can be stolen, if decree can be sabotaged, if a divine council can split, if the gods can disagree on annihilation, then what is order really? Is it natural, or is it maintained constantly, the way an empire is maintained by labor, maintained by coercion, maintained by the distribution of burdens, maintained by negotiation when force is too costly, maintained by force when negotiation fails? So, even when the academic reading is correct, when these narratives are theological and symbolic, they remain strangely precise about the mechanics of governance. Not just the morality of governance, the mechanics. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because precision can be a literary choice, yes. But when it repeats across centuries, across different compositions, across different languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, something else starts to come into view. A shared tradition, a stable memory, not necessarily a literal documentary record in the modern sense, but a tradition that keeps the same structural bones intact, as if changing them would break something important. Here is one example that refuses to be smoothed away. In Atrahasis before the flood, there is a labor crisis, not among humans, among gods. A class of younger gods, the Agigi, are assigned the crushing work of maintaining the world, digging canals, dredging rivers, carrying baskets of soil, for 3,600 years, the text says. Maybe symbolic, maybe literal within the story's own math. Either way, the number is not the point. The point is duration. The point is exhaustion, that lasts so long it becomes identity. And then, at a certain point, the system breaks. The Igigi do not merely complain, they organize. They burn their tools. They march at night. They surround Enlil's house. They besiege him. The word used is the word used for siege, not metaphor, siege. And the highest authority responds like a ruling authority responds. Summons a council, demands the ringleaders, considers execution. Then, because force is judged too costly, negotiates, creates a substitute labor force, creates humanity. If you've heard that story before, you may think you already know what it means. Humans exist to work. The gods created us to relieve themselves. End of lesson. But the text itself does not feel satisfied with that simplicity. It lingers on procedure. It lingers on the council. It lingers on the legal reasoning. It lingers on the fact that the rebellion is called war. And if you let those details breathe, they start to ask something else. If even gods can strike, if even gods can besiege the house of their ruler, if even gods can force a structural reorganization, then the hierarchy is not stable. It is held together by compliance. And compliance can be withdrawn. This is a fracture line, and fractures do not disappear just because you patch the surface. They remain under pressure, waiting for the next stress. So when you see later conflicts, Anzu stealing the tablet of destinies Enki, and Enlil splitting over the fate of humanity, Marduk demanding permanent kingship as the price of saving the system, you start to recognize that earlier fracture. The first war is not a battlefield war. It is a labor war. But once a labor class can say no, the rulers learn something they cannot unlearn. They learn that authority is not only declared, it is maintained. And maintenance, as these tablets keep showing us, has a cost. The first war among the Anunnaki begins in an unglamorous place. Not with a battlefield, not with a primordial monster rising from the sea. It begins with labor, with baskets, with spades, with the long grinding repetition of a task that never ends. The Atrahasis epic, written in Akkadian, surviving in multiple old Babylonian copies, opens as if the audience already knows the world it is describing. Anu in the heavens, Enlil governing the earth, Enki ruling the subterranean waters, the Abzu. And beneath that high structure, the work that keeps the system functioning. Canals must be dug, rivers dredged, irrigation maintained. In this worldview, the earth is not a self-sustaining garden. It is a managed landscape, and management requires hands. So the work is assigned to a class of gods called the Igigi. You see the term across Mesopotamian texts, sometimes blurred with Anunnaki. But in Atrahasis, the distinction is clear. The Igigi are numerous, subordinate, expendable. A workforce, not rulers, not kings, not the ones who convene the assembly, the ones who carry the basket. And the text does something strange. It emphasizes time. Not they worked for a while. Not they labored in the beginning. It says they carried the basket for 3,600 years. Again, we can debate the meaning of that number. But the narrative effect is unmistakable. This is not a brief inconvenience. This is an epic of burden. And burden sustained long enough becomes grievance. Then grievance becomes organization. and organization becomes threat. The epic is explicit. The Igigi hold council among themselves. They agree to act collectively. They burn their work tools, spades, baskets, like a ritualized declaration that the system cannot continue. And then at night, while Enlil sleeps, they march to his house. They surround it. They besiege it. That is the verb. The same verb used for encircling a city. The Igigi are not sending a petition. They are demonstrating force. They are reminding the ruler of the gods that even a ruler can be surrounded. Even a ruler can be cut off. Even a ruler can wake to the sound of bodies outside his walls. Enlil's gatekeeper hears the noise and panics. He wakes his lord. The gods have surrounded the estate. Enlil's first response is not philosophical. It is political. He sends for the other great gods. Anu, Enki, a crisis council. Because when the base of the hierarchy stops cooperating, the top cannot simply pretend it is a minor disturbance. The next sequence reads like procedure. Enlil rages. He calls the rebellion treason. He demands the ringleader be identified and killed. And Anu interestingly urges inquiry before judgment. Who began the war? The text says war, not protest, not riot, war. And Enki takes yet another position. He recognizes the grievance as legitimate. The work is too heavy, the burden too great. And what follows is one of the most revealing moments in the entire Mesopotamian tradition. The solution is not to free the rebels. The solution is to replace them. If the system requires labor, and the labor class has become dangerous, then create a new labor class. This is where humans enter the narrative, not as the crown of creation, not as the beloved children of the gods, as a substitute workforce, a pressure release valve, a structural compromise designed to prevent divine civil war from escalating into slaughter. The creation procedure is described with unsettling specificity. Enki proposes the plan. The birth goddess, named variously depending on the copy, provides the technical expertise. Clay is mixed with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god. The text names him, or at least marks him as a god who had rationality. He is executed for this purpose. His blood is kneaded into clay. And from that mixture, 7 males and 7 females are formed. The number repeats, 7 and 7. It feels ritualized, not improvised, as if the narrative is preserving the memory of a specific act carried out according to a specific method. And then the Igigi, after forcing this transformation, vanish, not celebrated, not thanked, not freed in a triumphant scene. They simply recede, as if the story's purpose is not to honor them, but to acknowledge their threat and then neutralize it. Later traditions sometimes merge Igigi and Anunnaki, smoothing the distinction, and you can read that as mythic simplification. Or you can read it as something else, a rebellious class absorbed into the hierarchy. After the crisis, their separate identity dissolved, so it cannot become a banner again. Either way, the rebellion establishes a pattern. Before the flood, before the tablet of destinies becomes the central prize, before Marduk's rise, there is already division within the divine system. A subordinate class can organize. They can besiege authority. They can force negotiation. And when the rulers concede, they do not concede out of mercy. They concede out of necessity, because force is too costly. because suppression risks collapse. Because the system requires labor, and labor has learned it can withhold itself. And that is the crucial point. The first war is not fought with swords or storms. It is fought with refusal, with coordinated withdrawal, with the silent power of no. If that is possible at the level of labor, then the hierarchy has already been compromised. And once compromised, it invites a larger question, one we will keep returning to again and again. If the crisis can restructure the system, once, why can't it be restructured again? If a class of gods can surround Enlil's house and force compromise, what happens when the crisis is not about burden, but about power? And if the system can be destabilized by workers, what happens when those closer to the throne decide they want the throne itself? The Atrahasis epic will eventually move toward the flood, toward that catastrophic final solution. Enlil proposes when humans become too numerous, too noisy, too difficult to manage. But the flood does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs after a precedent has been set. The gods can rebel. The gods can split. The gods can sabotage each other. The gods can lose control of their own policies. And once you let that precedent settle in your mind, the next question returns, and we will keep returning to it. If this was possible at the level of labor, what happens when the crisis is not about work, but about the weapon that controls reality itself? Once the story of the Igigi rebellion is in your mind, another theme becomes harder to dismiss. Because you start to see a world where power is not just a title, it is not just a name spoken in a council. Power in these texts is often attached to something you can hold, something you can steal, something you can wear. And among those objects, one appears again and again with a kind of insistence that feels almost nervous. The Tablet of Destinies. In Akkadian, it is the Tupi Shimati. In Sumerian traditions, it is imagined in similar terms, an inscribed tablet, the kind of object a Mesopotamian scribe knew intimately translated upward into divine scale. A clay tablet, marks pressed into it, a thing that looks in concept, like the very medium the myths are written on. And the texts tell you repeatedly what this object does. It confers authority, not just symbolic authority, not merely respect, but the capacity to decree fate, to issue binding commands, to convene the assembly, to make what you say become what is. And that is why it keeps being stolen. Because if authority is embodied in an object, then authority becomes portable. And if authority is portable, it becomes vulnerable. If it can be carried, it can be carried away. If it can be worn, it can be taken off. If it can be set down even briefly, it can be seized. So the question returns in different words in the way these tablets force questions to return. Why does sovereignty in Mesopotamian divine imagination behave like an artifact? Why does legitimacy behave like a tablet you can fasten to your chest? Why does the cosmos need a control object at all? Mainstream scholarship often asks, what does the Tablet of Destinies symbolize? And the standard answer is clear enough. It symbolizes legitimate authority, kingship, the right to rule. The idea that power is not merely strength, but recognition, sanctioned and formalized. In that reading, the tablet is narrative shorthand, a way for a myth to render an abstract concept as something visible and dramatic. And yes, this reading explains why Mesopotamian kings would find the motif useful, because earthly kings ruled through claims of divine sanction. because temples held seals, tablets, and legal documents as instruments of control. Because a culture whose lives were governed by written decrees could imagine the cosmos itself governed by written decrees. So the tablet fits the world. The tablet matches the bureaucratic reality of Mesopotamia, that writing is power, that the one who holds the record holds the authority. But then the texts do something uncomfortable. They refuse to let the tablet remain a static symbol. They turn it into a strategic asset. They make it the prize of war. In the myth of Anzu, the tablet sits with Enlil. He wears it when the gods convene, a visible sign that his decrees are binding. He is not merely respected, he is operational. He can command the system. And when the tablet is taken from him, his strength remains, but his authority collapses. The assembly cannot function. Decrees cannot be issued. The cosmic order stalls. In that moment, the tablet does not feel like a metaphor. It feels like infrastructure, a control mechanism, a thing that if removed makes the entire system seize up. And when you trace the tablet across narratives, it repeats this behavior. In the Enuma Elish Tiamat gives the tablet to Kingu and fastens it on his chest, formalizing him as commander. Again, physical transfer. Again, an object worn. Again, authority conferred through possession. And when Marduk defeats Kingu, he does not merely kill him. He takes the tablet. He seals it with his own seal. He fastens it upon himself. He carries it as proof and as mechanism. And only then does the assembly ratify his supremacy. So authority here has two components, the tool and the recognition. The tablet grants operational power, but legitimacy still requires the assembly's acknowledgement, which means the tablet is not omnipotence. It is not magic that overrides social structure completely. It is a weapon within a political system. A weapon that becomes decisive precisely because the system depends on it. This is why theft becomes catastrophic. Because if you steal the tablet, you don't just steal a symbol, you steal the means of command. And once you steal the means of command, negotiation becomes almost impossible. Because the one who holds the tablet can set the terms, and the one who lacks it cannot compel anything. So the same loop returns again, with slightly different phrasing. If the tablet is only a symbol, why does it behave like a weapon? If it is only narrative drama, why is the drama so consistent, so procedural, so focused on operational consequences? Why do arrows turn to reeds in midair? Why do spells lose their force? Why do even major gods refuse to confront the thief? Because they recognize the tactical impossibility. Those are not the usual moves of mythic symbolism. Or rather, if they are symbolism shaped like military problem solving. Which forces another slow question. Why would a culture imagine divine authority as something that can be defeated, not by righteousness, not by moral superiority, but by tactical adaptation? Because in the Anzu cycle, that is what happens. The enemy has ultimate authority. Conventional attacks fail. A counter-strategy must be devised. The solution is not be more virtuous. The solution is to saturate the defenses, to overwhelm the mechanism, to strike so rapidly that the tablet's protective decrees cannot keep pace. This is not the language of abstract morality. This is the language of tactics. And if the tablet is a metaphor, it is a metaphor that has been engineered like a piece of military hardware. So we do not rush. We do not declare prematurely that it must be a literal artifact of technology. as some speculative interpretations suggest. The texts themselves remain theological. They do not give us a manual. They do not open the tablet and show us gears or circuitry, but they do give us effects. They do tell us what happens when the tablet changes hands. And those effects are consistent enough to make you wonder if the scribes were preserving a memory, an experiential understanding of what power looked like when it was concentrated into a single object. In Mesopotamian thought, the ME functions similarly. Divine powers that can be possessed and transferred. Inanna loads them onto a boat. Enki sends servants to retrieve them. The story treats these powers as objects with logistics, not as abstract concepts floating in air. So the Tablet of Destinies begins to look like the apex of that logic, a master control over decree itself. And if that is the case, if authority can be stolen, if decree can be weaponized, then every conflict involving the tablet is not decorative mythology. It is existential war. Because whoever holds it determines what happens next, and whoever loses it becomes in that moment subject. This is why the tablet cannot be allowed to remain in the wrong hands. This is why its theft triggers crisis councils. This is why its recovery requires a warrior. And this is why in the next part, the narrative shifts from labor rebellion to something sharper and more dangerous, a coup attempt. A theft carried out during a moment of vulnerability. A war launched not to create order, but to restore command. The tablet has been taken, and the system has already begun to shake. The epic of Anzu survives in fragments spanning more than a millennium. Old Babylonian copies, later Assyrian versions. A story carried forward and recopied because it mattered enough to remain in circulation. And despite variations, the core remains stable. A divine being, Anzu, often depicted as a lion-headed eagle, steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil and must be hunted down by Ninurta. What follows is not framed as a moral fable. It is framed as war. And what makes it difficult to dismiss as mere motif is the tactical attention the text gives to the problem. Anzu is not some distant outsider. He is close. He has access. Depending on the version, he is guardian, attendant, doorkeeper, someone who moves near the inner sanctum of authority. And proximity breeds something the texts render with eerie clarity, ambition, resentment, a thought that repeats long enough to become decision. The narrative preserves Anzu's internal monologue. He reasons within himself. I will take the Tablet of Destinies. I will control the decrees of all the gods. I will establish my throne. I will direct all the Igigi. That last line matters because it loops back to labor, back to the first fracture. Anzu does not merely want to be powerful in isolation. He wants command over the workforce class, the same class that once besieged Enlil's house. He wants to restructure the hierarchy. He wants to become the one who gives orders that cannot be refused. So he waits. And the moment of theft is rendered with the kind of detail that makes you uneasy. Enlil bathes. He removes his regalia. He sets the tablet aside. A moment of vulnerability, a moment of inattention, and Anzu takes it and flees to the mountains. Immediately, the consequences spread. The text describes stillness, silence, suspension of the divine norms. Enlil is stunned, not merely angry, paralyzed. Because without the tablet, his decrees do not bind. The assembly cannot convene properly. The system stalls. And then the gods do what governing bodies do when infrastructure collapses. They hold a crisis council. Anu asks for a volunteer to go to war, not to negotiate, not to persuade, to go to battle. But the central military problem is obvious to everyone. Who can face an enemy holding the tablet? Who can strike when strikes can be reversed by decree? And the narrative does not gloss over this. It makes the refusals explicit. One god after another declines. Because the mission appears suicidal. The tablet can nullify weapons. Arrows can be sent back to their raw materials. Spells can lose force. A direct assault becomes meaningless. And if the narrative were simply symbolic, if it were just a dramatic story to glorify Ninurta, it could have skipped this dilemma. It could have said Ninurta went and triumphed. Instead, it lingers in the difficulty. It lingers in the refusal. It lingers in the tactical impossibility. Finally, the solution emerges again through Enki's kind of mind, the mind that looks for angles rather than brute force. Ninurta is chosen, but he cannot go with ordinary weapons. Special arrows are fashioned, and the strategy is not be stronger. It is saturation. Overwhelm the defense mechanism. Strike so rapidly with such volume that Anzu cannot issue counter-decrees fast enough. Because the tablet can reverse an arrow, but perhaps it cannot reverse a storm of arrows. The battle takes place in the mountains, the terrain itself emphasizing that Anzu is entrenched, fortified, hidden. And in the first confrontation, we see the tablet's power demonstrated with unnerving clarity. Ninurta shoots, and Anzu decrees return. Arrow back to the reed thicket, bow back to wood, bowstring back to gut. The projectile transforms mid-flight, falls harmlessly. The attack fails. Ninurta retreats, reports, regroups. The plan must adjust. This is not divine inevitability. This is campaign. Attempt failure, revision, renewed attempt. And then, in the climactic engagement, Ninurta unleashes the barrage. He attacks with sustained intensity. Anzu tries to counter, but the sheer volume breaks the rhythm. An arrow strikes, then another. The text becomes fragmentary at the decisive moment, different versions preserving different details. Sometimes the wings are severed. Sometimes the kill is direct. But the outcome is consistent. Anzu falls, and Ninurta retrieves the tablet. He returns it to Enlil. Order resumes. The assembly convenes. Ninurta is honored, named champion, praised, and in later cult practice, his temples celebrate him as the warrior who saved the system. Mainstream interpretation reads this understandably as legitimization, a myth that glorifies Ninurta, that models the restoration of rightful authority, that warns against hubris. Anzu becomes the rebel. Ninurta becomes the restorer. Kings see themselves in Ninurta. Rebels are cast as Anzu. The story reinforces political theology. But again, the question returns because the text itself keeps returning to it. Why is the symbolism so technical? Why does the enemy's power have such specific operational limits? Why do the gods refuse the mission based on tactical reasoning? Why is the solution not a moral triumph, but a strategic adaptation? And then another question begins to form, slower but heavier. Why did Anzu think he could succeed if the tablet grants ultimate authority? Why not decree victory outright? Why not simply command Enlil's submission? Why not end the war with a single decree? The narrative implies limits. Either the tablet is not omnipotence, or Anzu does not know how to use it fully, or legitimacy still matters, so that even with the tool, the thief cannot command compliance without recognition, or the tablet functions through processes that can be overwhelmed, or all of these at once. The text does not answer directly. It preserves the ambiguity, and the ambiguity matters because it becomes precedent. If authority can be stolen, once it can be stolen again. If the system can freeze, once it can freeze again. If war is the mechanism of recovery, once war becomes the default response. There is no negotiation with the thief. There is no compromise. There is only retrieval, and retrieval means violence. So the tablet is restored, and Lil's authority resumes. But the system has revealed its fragility, its dependence on an object, its vulnerability to internal coups, its need for warriors. And once you see that fragility, the next layer of conflict becomes almost inevitable. Because if a subordinate can attempt a coup, what happens when those nearer the top, those with equal rank, those bound not by servitude, but by kinship? What happens when they disagree? What happens when the conflict is not Anzu versus Enlil, but brother versus brother? That rivalry does not explode in open war like Anzu's theft. It lingers, it repeats, it returns in every crisis. And it will shape the most catastrophic weaponization of policy the Mesopotamian corpus preserves. In the next part, we turn to the rivalry that never fully resolves Enlil and Enki. Two powers within the same system, two approaches to governance, two voices in the council, and a universe that keeps tilting toward catastrophe whenever they cannot agree. Once the tablet of destinies has been stolen and recovered, once the system has already demonstrated how fragile it can become, the focus shifts. Not away from war, not away from conflict, but towards something colder, something that doesn't always look like war on the surface, yet produces war as an outcome. A rivalry, a persistent disagreement that returns in crisis after crisis, like a recurring argument that never truly ends. At the center of the Anunnaki hierarchy, across dozens of texts, we keep meeting the same pair, Enlil and Enki. In Akkadian sources, Elil and Ea. Brothers sometimes framed as literal brothers, sometimes as cosmic counterparts, but always placed in a relationship that is not simple alliance. Enlil is authority, storm, assembly, decree, the one who convenes the gods and issues binding decisions. Enki is counsel, water, craft, loophole, the one who solves problems through cunning when force fails. And the strange thing, the thing that repeats so consistently, it begins to feel structural, is that they rarely agree about humanity. Not once. Not as a stable pattern. They may share the same cosmos, the same hierarchy, the same need for order. But when it comes to the human population, when it comes to the question of whether humans should be preserved, restrained, punished, reduced, or destroyed, these two brothers take opposite positions almost every time. And the resolution is rarely consensus. It is maneuver. It is sabotage. It is one brother issuing a decree and the other finding a way around it. And the system somehow limps forward, never fully healed, never fully unified. We saw the earliest trace of this dynamic already in that small, broken Sumerian fragment, CBS 10673, the Aridu Genesis. Even in its fragmentary state, the structure is clear enough. Humanity multiplies, noise rises, Enlil cannot rest, and he reacts not by improvisation, but by procedure. He brings the problem to the divine assembly. He proposes measures: plague, famine, drought. The text implies agreement policy, ratified, execution authorized. And yet the measures fail. Not because Enlil lacks power, not because the gods cannot execute punishment, but because someone undermines it. Someone ensures that humanity survives. In later traditions, and more explicitly in Hypotheses, that someone is Enki. The pattern becomes unmistakable. Enlil is the one who says reduce the population. When reduction doesn't work, eliminate them. Enki is the one who says manage the population, adapt the system, preserve the labor force. And the conflict between those positions doesn't stay theoretical. It becomes operational. It becomes policy versus counter-policy. Decree versus loophole. If you read this quickly, you might treat it as simple moral contrast. Enlil is harsh. Enki is merciful. But the texts do not frame it as sentimental morality. They frame it as governance logic. Enlil's logic is elimination. If the source of disorder exists, remove it. If humans are noisy, reduce their numbers. If they remain noisy, erase them. Enki's logic is regulation. If humans are noisy, change the conditions that produce noise. If population is too high, impose limits on reproduction. If limits fail, preserve a remnant and rebuild under new constraints. This is not merely kindness, it is management. And that distinction matters because it keeps bringing us back to the same question in different forms. What kind of gods argue like administrators? What kind of divine hierarchy thinks in terms of labor, force, productivity, and system maintenance? What kind of cosmic order depends on human beings so much that annihilating them becomes not simply judgment, but self-harm? Hypotheses makes this explicit in its aftermath scenes. After the flood, when Enlil sees smoke rising from sacrifice, he is not comforted. He is enraged, because smoke means someone survived, and survival means the decree was sabotaged, so he accuses. And Enki does not deny. He deflects. He uses legal reasoning, technicality, casuistry. He says, I did not reveal the secret of the great gods. I spoke to a wall. I showed him a dream. He understood. And Enlil, for all his authority, cannot undo the fact of survival. The remnant exists. The system must continue. So the assembly negotiates. Again, that negotiation is important because it tells you something about the hierarchy. Enlil can decree destruction, yes, but he cannot compel absolute obedience even among gods. Not permanently, not when Enki refuses, not when the system depends on cooperation. So, authority in this pantheon is not absolute sovereignty. It is coalition sovereignty, delegated and contested, maintained through alliances and enforcement, and vulnerable to internal dissent. That is why the rivalry matters. Because Enki is not a minor dissenter. He is one of the central pillars. And if one pillar constantly leans away from another, the structure sways. The texts over and over show a cosmos that sways. Enlil issues decrees. Enki finds ways around them. Enlil becomes furious. Enki argues pragmatically. The assembly compromises. And then later the cycle repeats. A stable system would resolve a foundational dispute. This system does not resolve. It manages, it postpones, it patches, and even when the tablets grow quiet for a moment, the disagreement remains underneath, waiting like a storm held back by nothing more than habit. Mainstream scholarship explains Enlil and Enki as personified principles, authority versus wisdom, force versus cunning. That interpretation helps, and it is not wrong. But it doesn't fully account for the consistency of their conflict being focused almost exclusively on humanity. If they are simply abstract principles, why is the clash so specific? Why does it return again and again to policies of population control, labor, and annihilation? Why do they not fight over weather systems, underworld jurisdiction, or cosmic mechanics with the same narrative intensity? Why is it always, what do we do with the humans? This is where some scholars offer sociological readings, rival cult centers, Nippur versus Aridu, priestly factions promoting different patron deities. And yes, those tensions may have shaped the way stories were told, but the texts themselves preserve the rivalry as something deeper than civic propaganda. They preserve it as a structural feature of governance. Two dominant powers with incompatible strategies forced to coexist because the system requires both. Enlil's authority gives order. Enki's ingenuity prevents collapse. Remove Enlil and you have no binding decree. Remove Enki and you have no flexible adaptation. Together they create stability. Together they also create instability. Because their very coexistence ensures that no decree is final, no policy is secure, no solution lasts. And when cold conflict persists long enough, it produces escalation. Because each failed measure increases pressure. Each sabotage decree increases rage. Each compromise leaves unresolved resentment, until the system reaches for something it should not reach for, a weapon too large, a policy too absolute, a final solution. And in Mesopotamian literature, that weapon is the flood, which means the flood is not just a disaster story. It is the most catastrophic expression of a rivalry that never stopped. It is governance failure scaled to the entire world. It is policy turned into annihilation. And it is also, crucially, sabotaged. So, in the next part, we move into the moment where divine disagreement escalates beyond negotiation, where one faction deploys mass destruction, where another faction preserves a remnant, and where the gods themselves unnervingly seem to realize too late that they have lost control of what they unleashed. We are used to reading flood stories as moral tales. Humans become wicked, the gods become angry, judgment falls, a righteous survivor endures, a new world begins. It is a familiar arc, repeated across cultures, refined into something almost comforting, the idea that catastrophe is meaningful. But in the Mesopotamian texts, the older versions, the ones closer to the clay, the flood does not feel comforting. It feels strategic. It feels like policy. It feels like something authorized in council, executed by multiple agencies, and then only afterward regretted. And that is why, if we are moving slowly, we keep circling the same question. Is the flood a punishment story? Or is it a weapon deployed in a factional conflict the gods can no longer manage? Atrahasis gives us the clearest procedural chain. Humanity multiplies, noise rises, Enlil cannot rest. So he brings the matter to the assembly, not once, but repeatedly. Because the first attempt is not annihilation. The first attempt is reduction. Plague. the plague god is sent. Humans die in large numbers. And then quietly, Enki intervenes. He instructs the survivors to focus offerings on the plague god to appease the one executing the policy until the policy relents. And it works. The plague ends. Humanity recovers. The noise returns. Enlil convenes the assembly again. And again the measure is incremental. Drought. The rain god withholds rain from above. Enki, interestingly, is instructed to withhold water from below ceiling springs. Upper and lower waters coordinated. A joint blockade. For years the drought holds. Famine spreads. Human beings weaken, die. And again Enki finds a way to keep a remnant alive through guidance, through loopholes, through management of resources the blockade does not fully control. So the drought ends. The population begins to recover. The noise returns. Again, the council. Again, escalation. A broader embargo, the gods withhold blessings across the board. The earth becomes barren. Social order collapses. The text does not flinch from describing horror. Mothers eat their children. Human life approaches extinction. And still somehow Enki prevents total elimination. Not because he is sentimental, because the gods depend on humanity, because the system requires labor and offerings, and because annihilation would cut off the gods' own supply. So, at the fourth council, Enlil's patience breaks. And we should sit with that moment, not rush past it, because this is where governance becomes war. Enlil proposes the flood, not a localized punishment, not a partial disaster, a total inundation water from above and below, coordinated across all divine authorities of storm, river, dam, ocean, and subterranean deep. A weapon designed to remove the possibility of survival. A weapon designed so sabotage cannot succeed. And because sabotage has succeeded before, Enlil demands secrecy. An oath. All gods swear not to warn humanity. The plan is authorized. And yet the plan is not unified. Even in the moment of oath, the system is divided. Enki has already decided to violate it. The text lingers on how, because how matters. Enki does not simply shout a warning. He does not stand in the open and defy the assembly directly. Tear down your house. Build a boat. Reject that. Tear down your house. Build a boat. Reject possessions. Save life. The instructions are precise dimensions, construction methods, waterproofing loading protocols. This is not mythic vagueness. This is blueprint language. As if the text wants you to understand that survival here is engineered, not accidental. Atrahasis obeys. He dismantles his house. He builds. He loads aboard family craftsman livestock seed. As if what Enki is preserving is not merely a few lives, but the continuity of civilization. And then the flood begins. 7 days and 7 nights. Storm above, deep below, dams broken, winds driven. And the description is not triumphant. It is terror, not only human terror, divine terror. The gods themselves recoil from the weapon they deployed. They cower like dogs against the outer wall of heaven. They regret. They weep. The birth goddess who helped create humans cries out that her people now fill the sea like fish spawn. This matters, because it is not how we expect omnipotent beings to behave. If this were pure narrative of righteous judgment, the gods would be confident. Instead, they look like authorities who have unleashed something too big. Authorities who underestimated their own weapon. Authorities who in the moment of execution realize they have lost control. And then the flood subsides. Atrahasis opens a window, sees corpses floating like fish, offers sacrifice, smoke rises, and the gods swarm around it like flies, hungry, desperate, dependent. Again, the text does not flatter the gods. It reveals need. It reveals vulnerability. It reveals that without humans, the gods suffer deprivation. So, when Enlil arrives and sees the survivor, his rage is not abstract. It is political rage. Someone broke unity. Someone sabotaged policy. Someone ensured that the final solution failed. And Enlil's question is blunt. How did any man escape? None were to survive. Enki's defense is not mercy. It is argument. It is strategy, critique. Why impose total destruction? Why cut off the whole? Punish the sinner for his sin, yes. Reduce the people through lions, through wolves, through famine, through plague, methods that control population without eliminating the labor force. Enki reframes the flood as inefficient, as overkill, as policy failure. And the assembly again compromises. Not because Enlil suddenly becomes gentle, because the system must continue. So new controls are imposed, human lifespans shortened, reproduction regulated, infant mortality introduced, barren women, priestesses forbidden to bear children, mortality structured as governance mechanism, not as cosmic tragedy alone, but as administrative solution to prevent noise from rising to crisis again. The flood in this reading is not divine judgment. It is mass destruction deployed as population control policy. It is the escalation that occurs when internal dissent makes lesser measures unreliable. And it is sabotaged, meaning the hierarchy cannot compel unity even under oath, meaning authority is fragile, meaning the gods, like human rulers, can lose control of their own weapons. If you want a quiet milestone here, one small pause, take it now. Because what we've just watched is not myth in the comforting sense. It is the anatomy of escalation. Plague, drought, embargo, flood, and then emergency negotiation. And the question returns once more because it will not leave us alone. If one faction can authorize annihilation, and another faction can preserve a remnant, what kind of system is this? And what happens next when a younger generation looks at that dysfunction and concludes that the old rulers can no longer govern? That is where we go next. Because after a weapon like the flood has been deployed, and after the council has revealed its cracks, the stage is set for regime change on a divine scale. A generational coup, a younger god demanding permanent authority as payment for saving the system. Marduk's rise, a restructuring of heaven that is not creation from nothing but conquest. And the same question again under a different mask. When order collapses, who gets to rebuild it, and at what cost? It's common to call the Enuma Elish a creation epic, and it is in the sense that it contains a narrative of how the world is organized sky above earth, below stars in their paths, calendars fixed, temples built. But the closer you stay to its structure, the more that label starts to feel incomplete. Because the Enuma Elish is not primarily about creation out of nothing. It is about regime change, a generational transfer of authority that occurs through war, a crisis that the old leadership cannot solve, a younger God who offers salvation only in exchange for permanent sovereignty, and an assembly that agrees because it has no alternative. If we've been moving slowly, you can feel how this follows from everything before it. Labor revolt shows the hierarchy can fracture. The tablet of destinies shows authority can be seized and transferred. Enlil and Enki show policy can be sabotaged. The flood shows catastrophic weapons can be authorized and regretted. Now the younger generation looks at the older generation's instability and asks, without saying it directly, why should they rule at all? The Enuma Elish begins in a time before the current order. Primordial waters, Apsu fresh, Tiamat salt. From their mingling, the first gods are born, and almost immediately the familiar complaint appears so familiar it starts to feel like a refrain of Mesopotamian political theology. Noise, disturbance, restlessness. Apsu cannot rest. And his proposed solution is chillingly familiar too. Eliminate the source. Destroy the younger gods. Restore quiet. It echoes Enlil's later policy toward humans so strongly that it becomes difficult not to notice. Authority disturbed by the presence of a populous group proposes destruction as restoration. Tiamat initially resists. She argues against killing their own offspring. But Apsu persists. He and his advisor plan secretly. And then the younger gods learn of the plot. Enki, again, the one who finds Angles devises counterstrike. A spell, Apsu put to sleep. Apsu killed. And Enki establishes his domain over the slain older god, claiming the Abzu. So already before Marduk even appears, the epic establishes a pattern. The older generation plots annihilation. The younger generation responds with violence. Authority changes hands not by persuasion, but by killing. And then Marduk is born. And the text lingers on his qualities in a way that feels like an announcement. 4 eyes, 4 ears, flames from his mouth, a being qualitatively different, presented as superior from birth. It is as if the epic wants to tell you something new has arrived, and the old order will not survive. Tiamat, after Apsu's death, is persuaded pushed into war. She gathers monsters. Serpents, dragons, scorpion men, storm demons. An army. And she elevates Kingu as her champion. And to formalize his command, she gives him the Tablet of Destinies. Fastens it on his chest. Again, physical transfer of sovereignty. Again, authority embodied in an object. The younger gods panic. Anu retreats. Enki cannot face Tiamat. The old leaders fail. The crisis council convenes. And this moment matters because it is so nakedly political. Marduk is proposed as champion, but he does not simply volunteer out of duty. He negotiates. He sets terms. If I defeat Tiamat, you will grant me permanent kingship. My decree will be unalterable. My word will be law. In other words, I will not be a temporary emergency hero. I will be the new regime. The assembly hesitates, because agreeing to this is agreeing to their own subordination. But necessity overrides reluctance. They test Marduk's power, make a garment vanish and reappear by word alone. He does it. They accept. They swear. They grant him authority. And what you are watching again is not creation myth in the innocent sense. You are watching a political contract made under duress. The assembly authorizes a new sovereign because the old system cannot protect itself. Then comes the battle. And it is described with mythic grandeur, winds, storms, nets, lightning, but also with tactical detail. Marduk releases the winds into Tiamat's mouth as she opens it to strike, inflating her body, preventing her from closing her jaws. Then he shoots. The arrow pierces her. Tiamat dies, and then the crucial act occurs. Marduk captures Kingu, takes the tablet of destinies from his chest, seals it with his own seal, fastens it upon himself. This is legal logic in narrative form. The transfer of sovereignty is not complete until the object is transferred. Authority is taken physically. Then Marduk delivers the tablet to Anu as proof and acknowledgement, a gesture that simultaneously honors the old hierarchy and replaces it, because he is now the one who holds the mechanism of command. And only then does he begin the creation work, organizing the cosmos, assigning roles, fixing celestial movements, establishing calendar and order. This is the crucial reframing. Order emerges not from peaceful design, but from conquest. Creation is the administrative aftermath of victory. And then humanity is created again by mixing clay with divine blood. But here the blood is explicitly that of Kingu, defeated commander of the opposing side. Humans are formed from the essence of a rebel. And the purpose is stated without ambiguity. Humans exist to do the work, to build temples, to provide offerings, to free the gods from labor. It is the same logic as atrahasis, but now embedded inside an epic that justifies a new sovereign. Finally, the gods bestow 50 names upon Marduk. 50, a number associated with Enlil, a symbolic transfer of Enlil's supremacy into Marduk's person. Not necessarily through killing Enlil, but through absorbing his function. The regime change completes. Mainstream scholarship reads all of this as Babylonian imperial ideology, and that reading explains much. A text recited at the New Year festival renewing the king's authority. A story elevating Babylon's god above older cult centers. A myth that legitimizes political supremacy by making it cosmic. Yes. But the epic is also unusually honest about the violence and coercion involved. Marduk does not inherit, he demands, he bargains. The assembly agrees because it must. And the cosmos is reorganized on the corpse of the defeated. So the question returns, because it always returns. What prevents this from happening again? If the older generation's instability produced crisis war and regime change, then why assume Marduk's order is permanent? Consolidation reduces factional dispute, yes, but consolidation creates vulnerability. If all authority rests in one figure, that figure becomes a single point of failure. And even as the gods praise the new king, you can sense the thinness of the peace because a system that needs a savior has already admitted it cannot save itself. Later texts will confirm this. Because Marduk's authority, like Enlil's before him, depends on presence, on vigilance, on maintenance. And when maintenance lapses, something inside the system moves. Not to seize kingship, not necessarily to steal the tablet, but to unleash chaos during the vacuum. The next part moves away from generational coup and into another dimension of conflict. Not horizontal God against God within the same realm, but vertical, upper world versus underworld, a war of jurisdiction and boundary. Inanna's descent, a failed invasion, and a reminder that the cosmos is not one unified empire, but multiple sovereignties with laws that cannot simply be overridden. Not all divine conflict in Mesopotamian literature is fought across the same plane. Some wars are about who sits on the highest throne. Some are about who holds the tablet. Some are about whether humanity should live or die. But there is another kind of conflict, one that runs vertically, above and below, life and death, the upper world and the underworld. And the descent of Inanna is one of the most striking records we have of that vertical tension. It is often read as seasonal allegory. Dumuzi descends, vegetation dies. He returns, life renews. And that ritual function is real. But the narrative itself, when you read it slowly, is not written like an agricultural poem. It is written like an invasion story. Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love and war and political power, is not a figure who accepts limits easily. Other myths show her stealing the me from Enki, loading divine powers onto a boat, transferring authority into her own city. She takes. She moves power. So when she decides to descend to the underworld, the text frames it with preparation. She dresses in full regalia. She gathers 7 instruments of power. She instructs her servant Ninshuber, "If I do not return in 3 days, go to the great gods and demand help." This is not the posture of a guest attending a funeral. This is the posture of someone who expects resistance. She arrives at the first gate and demands entry. The gatekeeper asks, "Why have you come?" Inanna offers a cover story, funeral rites for the dead husband of Ereshkigal. But Ereshkigal is suspicious, and she orders protocol. Admit Inanna? Yes. But enforce the laws of the underworld. Then the stripping begins, gate by gate, object by object, crown removed, necklace removed, breastplate removed, ring removed, measuring rod and line removed, robe removed. At the 7th gate, she is naked. And at each gate, Inanna protests, demanding explanation. And at each gate, the same answer returns, repeated like a legal refrain. Be silent. The laws of the underworld are perfect. They must not be questioned. This repetition matters because it establishes jurisdiction. The underworld is not a province of the upper world. It is its own sovereign realm, and its sovereignty is maintained not by brute force alone, but by procedure, by law, by protocol that strips visiting power of its instruments before it can act. So when Inanna enters Ereshkigal's throne room, she is not symbolically humbled. She is systematically disarmed. And then the narrative makes something unambiguous. Inanna attempts to seize the throne. She pushes Ereshkigal aside and sits on it. This is not metaphor. This is coup attempt. Vertical expansion, a conquest of the realm below. And Ereshkigal responds with the authority of her domain. She fixes the eye of death upon Inanna. Inanna dies. Instantly, her corpse is hung on a hook like meat. 3 days pass. Ninshuber goes to Enlil. He refuses. She goes to Nana. He refuses. Inanna got what she deserved, they say, for overreach. Only Enki agrees to help, and his method is consistent with everything we've already seen. Not direct assault, not brute force, a workaround. He creates 2 small beings from the dirt under his fingernails, genderless, categoryless. Beings who can slip past underworld defenses because they do not fit its classifications. He instructs them empathize with Ereshkigal's pain, mirror her agony, offer compassion, and in exchange ask for the corpse. They descend. They find Ereshkigal in labor-like suffering, groaning alone. They mourn with her, and she is shocked because no one mourns in the underworld. No one sympathizes. So she offers them a gift. They ask for the corpse. She grants it. They sprinkle the water of life and food of life. Inanna revives. But here is the crucial point. Revival does not override law. No one leaves the underworld without providing a substitute. Inanna cannot simply walk away. Her rescue must satisfy the jurisdiction she violated. So she ascends, escorted by demons, enforcers of underworld law, who will seize the replacement. Inanna encounters those who mourned for her. She spares them. But when she finds Dumuzi, her husband dressed in finery, seated on a throne, not mourning at all, she gives him up. A betrayal, or justice, or both. Dumuzi flees, is captured. And then comes compromise again, that Mesopotamian pattern of negotiated settlement after crisis. Dumuzi spends half the year below. His sister takes the other half. A split burden, a permanent tribute extracted by the underworld as restitution. So, yes, you can read this as seasonal cycle. But notice what the narrative itself emphasizes. Inanna invaded. She failed. She died. She returned only by negotiation and loophole. And she paid for it with a permanent extraction from her household. The underworld remained sovereign. Ereshkigal remained queen. And the upper world was forced to accept a new arrangement. This is not the pattern of Marduk's coup, where victory restructures the hierarchy. This is the pattern of a war lost terms accepted, which means the Mesopotamian cosmos is not one empire, but multiple empires stacked. Sovereignties with boundaries that cannot simply be overridden. And that matters because it reframes the nature of divine war. Not all wars end with the attacker crowned. Some end with the attacker humiliated, punished, and forced into a permanent compromise. And that in turn makes the next question unavoidable. If even a powerful goddess cannot conquer the underworld, then what happens when the system's central authority leaves its seat even briefly? What happens when the throne is not attacked from above or below, but left unattended? Because in the era, epic, that is exactly what happens. And the result is destruction unleashed not by an external enemy, but by a subordinate force inside the hierarchy itself. That is where we go next. After Marduk's victory in the Enuma Elish, it's tempting to believe the story has reached its endpoint. A new king crowned, a new order established, a cosmos reorganized, yes, a single sovereign holding the tablet, holding the names, holding the authority that had once been distributed and contested. And yet the Mesopotamian tradition does not let you rest there. It doesn't give you the comfort of permanence. It doesn't allow the idea that a regime change, no matter how decisive, has solved the deeper problem. Because even after Marduk rises, the texts continue to show what they have shown from the beginning order is contingent. Authority is fragile, and the most dangerous threat is not always the external enemy. Sometimes it is the vacuum. Sometimes it is what happens when the center is absent. The era epic preserved on first millennium tablets gives us a different kind of war. Not a war of succession. Not a war over the tablet of destinies. not a war of vertical invasion. A war of opportunism waged by a god whose function is violence unleashed when restraint lapses. Era is plague, mayhem, war, fever that sweeps through populations, the kind of force you do not defeat so much as contain. And the epic begins with restlessness. Era's weapons are rusting. His warriors' 7 fierce gods, the Sebiti, are idle. They urge him. They remind him of his power. They push him toward action. And already, if you've been listening carefully to the rhythm of these myths, you recognize the pattern and internal pressure builds. A force within the system wants motion. And if motion is not directed, it becomes destruction. Era hesitates, not out of mercy, not out of moral restraint, but because Marduk is present. Because Marduk's active governance constrains what Era can do. So Era devises a plan, and the plan is not a frontal rebellion. He does not seize Marduk's throne. He does not steal the tablet. He does something quieter, more political, more familiar. He creates a pretext. He approaches Marduk and criticizes the condition of his regalia. The divine garments are dull. They need refurbishment. And the only proper way to restore them, Era suggests, is for Marduk to leave Babylon temporarily and travel to the Anzu, where the craftsman gods can do the work. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, even necessary, even responsible. Authority depends on symbols, and symbols require maintenance. But beneath that surface, the tactic is clear. Remove the sovereign. Create absence. Create a gap, and gaps sooner or later happen. And even as Marduk hesitates because he understands what absence can unleash, Era promises restraint. He promises to maintain order. He promises essentially to hold the center in Marduk's place. Marduk agrees. He leaves. And the moment he is gone, Era acts. This is the point where the epic becomes almost unbearable in its clarity. Because it shows you that the system's stability depends not merely on Marduk's title, but on his presence. Not merely on his kingship, but on his active governance. Without him, the restraint fails. Era unleashes destruction. He incites war among neighbors. He sends plague into cities. He drives the gods themselves into disorder, causing them to abandon their proper roles and turn against humanity. The epic lingers on social collapse, cities burning slaughter, spreading priests, abandoning temples, children turning against parents, wild animals invading settlements. And notice the texture here. This is not strategic conquest. This is not a targeted policy. This is chaos released as a demonstration of what happens when authority lapses. And Era's 7 warriors, the Sebiti, amplify the destruction. They are not gentle servants. They are eager. They press him toward violence. They embody that terrifying idea that destructive power, once mobilized, develops momentum of its own. Isum Era's counselor tries to restrain him. He asks the question that always returns in these texts in one form or another: why destroy the very cities you are supposed to protect? And Era's answer is revealing because it is not purely irrational. He claims Marduk's rule has made gods weak and humans arrogant. He frames destruction as discipline, as test, as proof that the system cannot survive without constant governance. In other words, Era is making a political argument with a weapon. He is demonstrating vulnerability by exploiting it. But the epic does not portray this demonstration as cleanly controlled. The destruction expands beyond even Era's initial intent. Babylon itself, the sacred city, begins to collapse, temples endangered, offerings cut off, and the gods again begin to look frightened, not triumphant. They flee, they recoil, they behave like beings whose own ecosystem is collapsing beneath them. Because if cities fall and temples fall, the gods lose what sustains them. And Isam keeps pleading. He reminds Era of consequences. He reminds him of limits. He reminds him that annihilating the infrastructure of worship is self-destruction. And only then does Era begin to slow. Not because he has been morally convinced, because he has been pragmatically checked. And then Marduk returns. And here the epic makes another strange, sobering choice. The confrontation is not a spectacular battle. Marduk does not fight Era like Ninurta fought Anzu. He does not wage a war of arrows and storms. His presence alone reasserts order. Era's rage subsides. The Sebiti stand down. The gods return to their roles. The system begins painfully to rebuild. But the damage is done. Cities destroyed. Populations wiped out. Social fabric torn. And the epic ends with a blessing on those who recite it, as if the act of remembering naming Era, acknowledging his power, serves an apotropaic purpose. Not celebration, appeasement, containment through recognition. Mainstream scholarship often reads the Era epic as theological explanation for historical catastrophe for periods when Babylon suffered war and devastation. And that reading fits its function. But again, we return to the pattern the text itself preserves. Marduk's centralized order is efficient when present and dangerously fragile when absent. Enlil's older distributed system was unstable in its own way, factional, argumentative, but it had redundancy. If one pillar leaned, another could support. Marduk's system is a single pillar, and when the pillar steps away, the forces of destruction inside the system rush to fill the space. The epic lingers on that lesson, as if to say, you don't have to overthrow the throne to endanger the realm. You only have to leave it unattended. And that is the deeper horror. Because it means the system's peace is not a stable equilibrium. It is active maintenance, constant vigilance, presence, attention. And if that is true for the gods, what does it suggest about the human systems that took these stories seriously? If divine authority is fragile, human authority will be more fragile still. If divine kingship must be renewed in ritual, every year, human kingship must be renewed through conquest, propaganda, and force. And that is where the Sumerian king list comes back into view, not as dry chronology, but as the political echo of divine instability. Because once kingship descends from heaven into the human realm, it begins moving, city to city, dynasty to dynasty, struck down, carried off, taken, again and again. That movement is the next pattern we must hold up to the light. The Sumerian king list is often treated like a ledger. A strange document, part myth, part propaganda, part memory. A compilation that begins with impossible reign lengths and gradually approaches something like history. And yes, that's one way to read it. But if you stay with its language, if you listen to the repeated formulae rather than rushing toward the numbers, it begins to feel less like a ledger and more like a confession. A confession that kingship, once it enters the world, does not sit still. it moves. And it moves because it is taken. The Weld Blundell prism is one of the most complete surviving exemplars. A clay prism about 20 centimeters tall, inscribed on multiple faces. A physical object that resembles in miniature the very idea the list describes a transferable thing, a shaped artifact holding authority in written form. It opens with the famous line, "When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Aridu." That phrase is crucial. Kingship is not presented as human invention. It is presented as a gift or an imposition lowered from above, a power introduced into the terrestrial realm by divine action. And then the list proceeds through antediluvian kings, reigns of tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, numbers that do not fit normal human time. Mainstream scholars offer interpretations symbolic numbers corrupted counting dynasties rather than individuals, all plausible. But again, we are not rushing to settle it. We are watching patterns. And the pattern is not simply long reigns. The pattern is movement. Kingship is in one city, then it is in another, then another. And the transitions are not always gentle. The list uses phrases like was struck down, was defeated, was carried off. And those phrases are not neutral. They are military language. They imply violence. They imply conquest. They imply that political authority behaves like an object that can be seized. After the flood section briefly noted, almost like a hinge, the formula returns. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Again, lowered. Again, divine transfer. But then as the list moves forward, the language shifts. Kingship does not keep descending from heaven for every transition. It is taken. It is carried off. It is transferred by terrestrial dynamics, which suggests something important. Once kingship enters the human realm, it becomes subject to human conflict. It retains divine origins, yes, but it moves by conquest. And the list repeats that movement so often that it becomes rhythm. Held here, struck down, taken there, held there, struck down, taken again. And the list repeats its formula until it starts to feel like a chant, held, struck down, carried off, held again. A rhythm of power that never fully resolves. Certain lines are especially stark. Kish was struck down with weapons. Kingship moves to another city. A dynasty ends not with peaceful succession, but with defeat. And the list preserves this not as scandal, but as normalcy, as if violence is the expected mechanism of transfer, as if kingship is always provisional. There are other unsettling details. Overlapping dynasties that suggest multiple cities claimed kingship at the same time. Not a single smooth chain, but contested legitimacy. Competing claims. Perhaps civil war. Perhaps regional struggle. The list sometimes gives a name with no embellishment, and sometimes gives epithets that elevate a king into semi-divine aura. And even that variability hints at the politics of memory, which rulers were celebrated, which were merely recorded, which were remembered as foundational, which were remembered as conquerors. Gilgamesh appears. He is listed as king of Uruk, with a reign of 126 years. He is called divine. He is framed positively. And yet other texts depict him as oppressive, requiring divine intervention to restrain. So memory is not pure truth. Memory is edited. But even edited memory can preserve the fact of instability. And the list preserves instability relentlessly. Cities lose kingship and regain it. Kish holds kingship, loses it, regains it. authority circles back. Not because the gods keep lowering kingship from heaven again and again, but because cities fight for it. If kingship is divine authorization, why would the gods keep shifting it back and forth? The pattern makes more immediate sense if kingship is hegemonic dominance. Whoever holds military superiority claims the mantle. Divine rhetoric follows victory. Legitimacy follows conquest. Mainstream scholarship again reads the king list partly as propaganda compiled to legitimize a particular dynasty by presenting kingship as a single continuous institution moving toward the compiler's present. And that is likely true in function. But then the question returns. If the purpose is to legitimize continuity, why preserve so much discontinuity? Why openly note that dynasties were struck down? Why preserve overlap? Why preserve the scars? One answer is simple. The compilers inherited traditions that could not be erased without undermining the list's authority. To rewrite too much would reveal the hand of propaganda, so the violence remains. Another answer is darker. The violence is the point. The list normalizes conquest as the mechanism of kingship. It teaches scribes and students that this is how power works. You take it, you hold it, you lose it. Someone else takes it. And the list's broad geography reinforces that this is not village rivalry. These are major urban centers, Kish, Uruk, or Lagash, and more each with its own patron deity and economic base. Kingship moving among them suggests regional struggle for supremacy repeated across generations. The list does not describe divine wars directly, but if the divine realm is the template, if the gods themselves struggle over authority, if the tablet can be stolen, if the flood can be weaponized, if regime change can be achieved through war, then the king list reads like the human echo of that logic. Kingship descended from heaven, and once on earth, it behaved like the tablet of destinies, transferable, contested, seized, recovered, lost again. So the king list becomes part of the same pattern we've been tracing from CBS 1067-3 forward. Divine instability bleeds into terrestrial politics. Whether the gods were real in a literal sense or not, the logic preserved in these texts shaped how Mesopotamia understood authority. And now, with the pieces laid out, labor revolt stolen, tablet, brotherly, sabotage, flood, as weapon, generational coup, vertical jurisdiction, war vacuum catastrophe, and kingship's endless movement, we arrive at the last loop. The place where we ask what scholars say, what they don't say, and what remains unresolved. And we return one final time to the fragment in the vault. We have been circling a question for a long time, not in a straight line, not with the efficiency of a lecture, but the way the tablets themselves circle, returning, repeating, shifting angle, coming back again. So we do the same now. We return to mainstream scholarship, because the academic consensus is not ignorant. It is not a conspiracy of silence. It is built on serious work, linguistics, archaeology, comparative mythology, textual criticism. And the consensus reading is coherent. The gods are theological figures. Their conflicts dramatize principles. The Agigi rebellion explains why humans labor. The tablet of destinies symbolizes legitimate authority. Anzu's theft legitimizes Ninurta's cult. The flood explains mortality and disaster. Marduk's victory legitimizes Babylonian supremacy. Inanna's descent explains seasonal cycles and the power of death. Era explains catastrophe during political crisis. The king list is propaganda mixed with legend and increasing historical memory. All of these interpretations account for function, how these texts were used, why they were copied, why they mattered in ritual and ideology. And those functions are real, but function is not the entire story. Because as we've seen, certain details resist being flattened into mere symbolism. And it's those details that keep pulling us back like a hook in the clay. Why does Atrahasis describe the labor revolt with such procedural specificity? Council meetings, collective action, siege language, negotiation, structural compromise. Why does the Tablet of Destinies behave consistently as an object worn stolen, carried recovered across different compositions? Why do gods refuse to confront Anzu? Because they recognize the tactical impossibility. Why does the narrative preserve a counter-strategy based on overwhelming defenses rather than granting victory through moral assertion? Why does Enki repeatedly use technical loopholes, speaking to a wall, sending categoryless beings, reframing violations through legal reasoning, like a clever administrator navigating policy constraints? Why does the flood narrative portray the gods as terrified, cowering, regretting swarming around sacrifice like flies, dependent, shaken, as if they unleashed a weapon too large even for themselves? Why does the Enuma Elish portray Marduk's ascent as transactional bargaining under crisis? Why does the Era epic show centralized authority, failing simply through absence? Why does the king list preserve a rhythm of kingship, moving through, struck down, and carried off, as if violence is the normal engine of legitimacy? Mainstream scholars can answer many of these with literary explanations. Concrete detail makes myths vivid. Technical procedures reflect the scribe's bureaucratic world. Objects embody abstractions. Conflict motifs are common across polytheistic traditions, and these answers have weight. But we keep returning to the same uneasy observation: the detail is not random. The pattern is not isolated. The loops repeat across centuries, across languages, across genres. The same structural dynamics, conflict, council oath, sabotage, compromise, appear again and again, which leads to the alternative. Reading the script has been exploring. What if these texts preserve not just symbolic truth, but institutional memory, not history in the modern documentary sense, but a remembered logic, how power works, how authority breaks, how systems fail? And if the Anunnaki were understood as rulers, whether literal beings or conceptualized forces, then their wars might have been remembered as wars, the way later people remember political upheavals, recast, mythologized, but anchored to a sense that something real happened. This is speculative, and it must remain speculative. The texts do not give us a discovered tablet of destinies in a museum case. We do not have an artifact labeled weapon used for the flood. We do not have a contemporary inscription saying this is literal history, not theological narrative. And the texts were copied, revised, transmitted across time, allowing mythologization and ideology to reshape them. So we do not pretend certainty. We do not declare a conclusion that the evidence cannot bear. Instead, we do what the tablets invite. We observe what remains consistent. What remains consistent is conflict. Divine conflict is not exceptional. It is structural. Authority is not permanent. It is contested. Order is not given. It is imposed, defended, and eventually challenged again. And even when a new order arises, Marduk's consolidation, it does not erase the underlying instability. It changes its form. It replaces factional dispute with single-point vulnerability. It makes the system stable only as long as the center holds, only as long as the king is present. And when the center steps away, era moves. So, the war the Anunnaki lost, if we keep using that phrase carefully, is not simply a war with Tiamat, or a war over the tablet, or the flood. It is the war for permanent stability. They never win it. Enlil's authority is stolen. His final solution is sabotaged. His supremacy is absorbed into another regime. Marduk's order is threatened by absence. Inanna's overreach is punished by the underworld's law. Kingly dynasties rise and fall, struck down, carried off, taken again. No victory lasts. Every resolution plants the next crisis. And that is the echo. An echo that persists not just inside Mesopotamian clay, but inside political logic itself. Because when you strip these stories down to their mechanics without rushing to make them comforting, you get a model of power that is brutally familiar. Control mechanisms matter. Legitimacy matters. Weapons of mass destruction exist. Oaths can be broken. Councils split. And systems depend on continuous maintenance. If maintenance fails, catastrophe follows. So, we return finally to CBS 10673. A fragment in a vault. A broken piece of clay, warm to the touch, heavier than you'd expect, impressed with marks that have waited 4,000 years. It does not announce itself. It does not explain its own importance. It assumes you already understand that what it records shaped everything that came after. When kingship descended from heaven, when the gods convened, when they voted, when they disagreed, when one god warned a man through a wall, when a flood swept over, when the survivor lived, when order resumed not because conflict ended, but because conflict was managed. And the fragment sits there, patient, as if to remind you that the record was never the problem. Forgetting was the problem. The tablets in their slow persistence do not let the pattern disappear. They preserve it. They repeat it. They make you return to it. And the question they leave you with is not a demand for belief, it's a demand for attention. If the gods themselves, however we interpret them, cannot build a system that does not require war to function, what does that mean for the systems we inherit? The Mesopotamian texts suggest the answer is grim. Conflict is structural. But perhaps that is why they preserve the record so carefully. Not to celebrate inevitability, but to warn. To show what happens when power speaks only the language of force. To show what happens when restraint fails. To show how quickly a council becomes a battlefield. And if you've followed the loops all the way here, you've seen the same pattern from different angles. Labor revolt, stolen, authority, sabotaged policy, catastrophic weapons, regime, change, jurisdictional limits, vacuum, collapse, and kingship's endless movement. You've seen what scholars say. You've seen what the tablets keep saying beneath the scholarly frame. And you've seen what remains unresolved. The decision of what it means rests with you. But the record remains. Inscribed in clay, stored in vaults, patient witnesses to a system that could never stabilize itself permanently. A war that in one form or another continues to echo whenever authority is contested, Whenever control mechanisms are seized, whenever councils fracture, whenever restraint fails, whenever a final solution is proposed, whenever the center steps away, and the forces inside the hierarchy rush to fill the gap. The tablets have been patient for 4,000 years. They will be patient for 4,000 more. And somewhere beneath Philadelphia, a small broken fragment keeps the opening line alive, waiting for each generation to pick it up again, metaphorically or literally, and ask the question the scribes assumed you would eventually ask. When kingship descended from heaven, the gods went to war. Humanity survived. And what exactly are we supposed to do with that memory?